two ships entered the Arctic with 129 men and vanished for 170 years. On May 19, 1845, the Erebus and Terror sailed from Greenhithe, England. They were the most technologically advanced vessels any nation had ever sent into the Arctic. Sir John Franklin commanded 129 officers and men, carrying 3 years of provisions and the quiet confidence of an empire that believed it had conquered every corner of the map. The Royal Navy had spent 30 years probing the Arctic for a northwest passage. Dozens of expeditions had mapped fragments of coastline. Franklin's mission was to connect those fragments into one unbroken shipping route from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was the moonshot of its era. The ships themselves were marvels. The Erebus and Terror had already survived Antarctic exploration under James Clark Ross. Their hulls were reinforced with thick iron plating. They carried early steam engines, retractable screw propellers, and even a railway track onboard for hauling boats across ice. The Navy spent over £20,000 retrofitting them, a staggering sum at the time. The provisioning was obsessive. They carried over 8,000 tins of food, packed using a new canning technology. There were thousands of pounds of pemmican, lemon juice to prevent scurvy, chocolate, tobacco, books, and even a hand organ that played 50 tunes. No expedition had ever been so thoroughly supplied. Sir John Franklin was 59 years old. He had survived starvation on a previous overland expedition in the 1820s, eating his own boots to stay alive. He was not the Navy's first choice. He was not even the second. But he was available, he had Arctic experience, and his wife Jane campaigned relentlessly for his appointment. So the command was his. By late July 1845, the expedition reached Lancaster Sound, the gateway to the Arctic. 2 whaling ships encountered the Erebus and Terror near Baffin Bay. The whalers reported the men in good spirits, the ships in excellent condition. This was the last time any European would lay eyes on Franklin, his officers, or his crew. Then silence. The Arctic swallowed them whole. No letters arrived. No supply deposits were found. No survivors stumbled into trading posts. The Royal Navy assumed the ships were simply frozen in for a winter, as planned. But 1 year passed, then 2. By 1847, the Admiralty began to feel the first cold whisper of alarm. Jane Franklin refused to wait. She lobbied Parliament, wrote letters to newspapers, and funded searches from her own pocket. Her pressure forced the Admiralty to act. Between 1848 and 1859, more than 30 expeditions would sail into the Arctic looking for her husband. The search for Franklin became the largest manhunt in history. The first clues came not from British searchers, but from Inuit hunters. In 1854, John Ray, a Hudson's Bay Company surveyor, spoke with Inuit who described seeing about 40 white men dragging a boat south over the ice near King William Island. They said some of the men had died. The Inuit also reported something darker, evidence that survivors had resorted to eating the dead. Ray's report sent shockwaves through Victorian society. The idea of English gentlemen resorting to cannibalism was considered monstrous. Charles Dickens publicly attacked Ray's account, calling the Inuit testimony unreliable. Jane Franklin refused to believe it, but the physical evidence Ray brought back, silver spoons, medals, and fragments engraved with the names of Franklin's officers, was undeniable. Which leads to the question everyone was asking: what actually happened to the Erebus and Terror? The answer came in pieces, assembled over more than a century from Inuit oral histories, scattered bones, and eventually, the wrecks themselves. And the picture that emerged was worse than anyone imagined. Here is what we now know. The ships sailed south through Peel Sound, a channel that had never been navigated before. They reached the northwest coast of King William Island by September 1846. There, the ice closed around them. They did not break free. Franklin himself died on June 11, 1847, the cause never confirmed. He never saw how the expedition would end. For over a year, the men remained aboard the frozen ships. They had food, shelter, and fuel. But something was already poisoning them, and they did not know it. The 8,000 tin cans of food that were supposed to sustain them were sealed with lead solder applied by a careless manufacturer named Stephen Goldner. The solder was applied thickly and unevenly. It leached into the food. Modern forensic analysis of bones recovered from the expedition found lead levels 75 times higher than normal. Lead poisoning causes confusion, weakness, irritability, and impaired judgment. The men were being slowly neurologically damaged while trapped in the most hostile environment on Earth. Their commander, Captain Francis Crozier, who took over after Franklin died, was likely affected too. But here's the twist. The lead was devastating, but recent studies suggest it may not have been the primary killer. Dr. Owen Beatty, a forensic anthropologist, exhumed 3 crew members buried on Beechey Island in the 1980s. Their bodies were perfectly preserved in the permafrost. The lead levels were high, but the real killer might have been something far more ordinary and far more terrifying. The food tins from Goldner were not just lead-contaminated. Many were improperly sealed and improperly cooked. Botulism likely spread through the provisions, and the meat inside was often spoiled before it was even canned. The men were eating rotten food sealed inside toxic containers. They were being poisoned and starved simultaneously by the very supplies meant to save them. On April 22, 1848, the survivors made a desperate decision. They abandoned the ships. 105 men, out of the original 129, dragged boats across the ice toward the Back River on the Canadian mainland. They hoped to reach a trading post hundreds of miles south. It was one of the most futile marches in the history of exploration. They carried boats loaded with supplies, silverware, books, and heavy equipment that served no survival purpose. They were dragging the vestiges of civilization across a killing ground. They did not understand the land. They did not know how to hunt the way the Inuit did. They did not know how to build proper snow shelters. They were gentlemen in a world that did not reward gentlemen. Inuit oral histories, recorded by later searchers, describe what they saw. They encountered men who were thin, weak, and walking in single file. Some were still dragging boats. Some had fallen and could not rise. The Inuit provided food when they could, but they themselves were often near starvation. The encounters were brief, confused, and final. The remains found along the southern coast of King William Island tell the rest. Bones scattered across miles of shoreline. Cut marks on some bones confirmed what John Ray reported in 1854. As the men died, the survivors divided the flesh from the bones of their crewmates. It was not savagery. It was the last rational act of men who knew no other way to keep walking. None of them reached the Back River. None of them reached safety. The march dissolved into a trail of bones that stretched for 60 miles along the coast. The last men likely died somewhere on the Adelaide Peninsula, though no one knows exactly where or when. The final hours of the Franklin expedition remain unwitnessed by any outside observer. So why does this matter beyond the horror? Because the Franklin expedition changed how the world understood the Arctic. The search missions launched to find Franklin mapped more of the Canadian Arctic than any single expedition ever could. The Northwest Passage was eventually charted through these searches. Franklin failed, but the failure itself produced geographic knowledge that shaped the modern map. But the deeper mystery remained. Where were the ships? For over 150 years, the wrecks of the Erebus and Terror eluded every searcher. Inuit had always known. They spoke of a ship that sank in deep water near an island they called O'Reilly's Island, and another that drifted further south before going down. But no one listened carefully enough to the Inuit accounts for a very long time. That changed in 2008. Parks Canada launched a systematic search using side-scan sonar and Inuit oral testimony as their primary guide. They focused on the exact areas the Inuit had described for generations. 6 years later, on September 2, 2014, a team led by Ryan Harris found the HMS Erebus in 11 meters of water near Queen Maud Gulf. It was almost exactly where the Inuit said it would be. 2 years after that, in 2016, the Terror was found in Terror Bay, 24 meters down, remarkably well preserved. The cold Arctic water had kept the ship almost intact. Cabins were still sealed. Plates still sat on shelves. The wheel was still in place. It was as if the ship had been frozen in the moment of its sinking. But the wrecks raised more questions than they answered. The Terror was found in a location that did not match any theory. It was in a bay the Inuit had specifically named. It appeared to have been remanned after being abandoned, sailed to a new position, and then deliberately or accidentally sunk. Someone was still alive and navigating after the official abandonment. The timeline does not fit the simple story of men walking to their deaths. Divers recovered artifacts from both wrecks. They found the ship's bell, ceramics, buttons, and personal items. But they have not yet found the logs. The written records of the expedition, the daily entries that would explain what decisions were made, what went wrong, and what the men experienced in those final months, remain somewhere inside the wrecks, possibly preserved in sealed cabins that have not yet been opened. Which means the Franklin expedition is not a closed case. It is a living investigation. The wrecks are still being explored. New artifacts are still being recovered. Inuit knowledge is still being integrated. And the fundamental question that Jane Franklin asked in 1847, what happened to my husband and his men, is still not fully answered. What we know is this: 129 men sailed into the Arctic with the best ships and the most supplies any expedition had ever carried. They were poisoned by their own food. They were trapped by ice they could not predict. They marched into a landscape they did not understand. They died one by one, and some survived long enough to make choices no one should ever have to make. What we do not know is everything that matters. We do not know Franklin's actual cause of death. We do not know who made the decision to abandon the ships. We do not know the sequence of deaths on the march. We do not know whether the ships were deliberately remanned or drifted on their own. And we do not know what words the last survivor wrote, if any, before the Arctic closed over them forever. The ice keeps its secrets, and the Franklin expedition is still buried inside them. If this mystery hooked you, subscribe for more lost expeditions and unsolved histories.